Well, let's start at the beginning, in a sense.
Very good.
Your family came to New York from Russia when?
Around 1910 or 1908, I'm not very sure. They came because they were, in a sense, refugees from the 1905 revolution, the counter-revolution that followed the 1905 revolution, when Nicholas II, of much esteemed memory these days, I gather, was hanging, sending to Siberia, and persecuting all the revolutionaries or even their sympathizers in Russia after the defeat of the 1905 Russian Revolution, the one that preceded the famous 1917 revolution.
And your family were active, obviously, politically in Russia before they left?
Well, my mother was, of course, very young. She was, well, I would say just about puberty. But my grandmother, who had been born in 1860 or thereabouts, was in the Russian Revolutionary Movement. She was a member of the Narodniki. I don't know if that means very much to most listeners, but they were the populists. Later, she became a socialist revolutionary party at that time. It was neither a Marxist nor strictly anarchist, but something of a hybridization of the two. It was not the Social Democratic Party, of which both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were factions. And she was active in Bessarabia, which now goes under the name of Moldavia, or whatever they call it, near the Romanian frontier. And she transported literature back and forth across the frontier, as well as exiles or incoming Russian exiles, and harbored students from the various universities who went to the people. That was the great movement to the people. And when they came to the United States, my mother imbibed these views, as did my uncle, with my grandmother. And my mother became a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was the great syndicalist union of enormous memory. Its songs and its traditions lived very energetically in the American labor movement. And with the Russian Revolution, which meant both the overthrow of the Tsar and finally the Bolshevik Revolution of November or October, as they like to put it, 1917, everybody became a communist, quite promiscuously, until things started to sort out and people began to try to understand what Leninism meant, which at that time was a total unknown in 1917. So she became a strong sympathizer of the communist movement, and I think perhaps for a brief period of time actually joined it in the 1930s. Personally, I was raised in a tradition which was very close to the revolutionary movement, Russian revolutionary movement. I knew all its heroes, its great Cossack leaders, Jenka Razin, about which there is a very dramatic song, sung incidentally by the Irish Republican Army, I understand, with English verses, and the second great rebellion, Emelian Pugachev, who rose up against Catherine the Great, quotes, close quote, and pretty nearly took Moscow. And then afterward, on and on, I became very familiar with the Russian revolutionary movement's history, Bakunin, Kropotkin, as well as Plekhanov, the Russian Marxist. The two I mentioned just before were anarchists. And Plekhanov and Chernyshevsky, the whole great Russian Enlightenment that took place in the 19th century and carried on well into the 20th century. And when I was about, give or take, 9 years old, I joined the Young Pioneers of America, which was the children's organization throughout the entire world of the communist movement. And owing to some gifts, they co-opted me at a very young age, between 13 and 14, into the Young Communist League. And that was a very exclusive type of movement in the early 1930s, because the communist movement had been engaged in its third period. The first period being the period between the Russian Revolution in 1923, when they felt there was a period of revolutionary ascendancy in Europe. The second period being the period of capitalist stabilization in the late 1920s. And the third period being the anticipated period of the Great Depression, when it was supposed that revolution would break out any moment, anywhere, at any time, and you always had to be prepared. So the Young Communist League and the Communist Party in the very early 1930s, both here, that here being the United States and abroad, including Britain, were very tight organizations. It was very difficult to get into them, and when you did get into them, you were very heavily indoctrinated, and you were given a great deal of responsibilities and a good many activities. It was a very, how should I put it, vanguardist, very taut, very revolutionary, extremely insurrectionary type of movement.
This was in a Jewish communist tradition, was it, in New York?
Well, you can hardly call it entirely Jewish. It was in Jewish neighborhoods, but we had a lot of Germans. In New York City, for example, until Hitler came to power, the great majority of German, politically radical Germans that I knew, living in Yorkville, which was a German district in New York City, were members of the Communist Party. We had a good many Italians. We had a good many people of many different backgrounds, but it was predominantly Jewish in New York, as it would have been predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in California. So it all varied. The communist movement at that particular point had a predominantly Jewish membership in New York City, but not entirely so. You had a great variety of people in there.
What was the language spoken in your home when you were young?
Well, when I was at birth, they spoke to me in Russian, and they were very secular, and they were not particularly concerned with they were not at all concerned with religious matters. In fact, they were atheists, avowed atheists. And by degrees, I began to pick up the English language, and bit by bit began to lose Russian. And before long, my knowledge of Russian became so very limited that I hardly can be said to know the Russian language now. So it was Russian, and it moved over to some Yiddish, I suppose. But it seems to me I never went to a Yiddish school, so I picked that up in my neighborhood in the streets. You picked up a lot of street languages. At that time in New York City, if you didn't know two languages, you were dysfunctional, because the great majority of people were immigrants, be they Italian, be they Irish, whatever, be they Spanish, or be they Jewish. So you had to know two languages. And I knew at one particular time in my life 3 fairly fluently.
Were you aware, when you were young, of the Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement in New York, the Freie Arbeiterstimme?
No, not at all. That's a tragedy. The Freie Arbeiterstimme, or Free Voice of Labor as it was called, was a waning movement. The anarchist movement had its heyday around the time of the First World War. And in the period after that, it began, tragically, to decline. But I got to know many of the people who were associated with the Yiddish anarchist movement before they died. I was a member of the Libertarian League. The Libertarian League was the traditionalist anarchist organization containing a very sizable number of Jews. But, let me add as well, there was no such thing as an exclusively Jewish anarchist movement. There was a Jewish anarchist press. But you must know that there were at least 4 different language anarchist periodicals: Spanish, Italian, Yiddish, and to some extent English. So you had at least 4 periodicals, anarchist periodicals. However, they were very restricted, and by the 1930s had been so greatly overshadowed by the communist movement that it was very difficult to be an anarchist in those days.
Just as an aside, Rudolf Rocker's son, Furman, lives about a quarter of a mile from here.
I met him, by the way, at least when he was in New York. I didn't know that, though.
So you were in the Young Pioneers movement?
Young Pioneers, and then I went into the Young Communist League. Now, the Great Depression hit us like a ton of bricks, as the saying goes, and we were all unemployed and on welfare. And by 1935, as the Depression eased out, it didn't disappear. It didn't disappear until the Second World War. But as we eased out of the economic depression at its very, very worst, and that meant for us being dispossessed of our homes, having our furniture on the street, having welfare workers, finding places for us to live, and living on a miserable income in extreme poverty. But as the Depression began to bit by bit soften and we began to move out of the Depression, the labor movement began to get underway on a massive scale in the United States. Tremendous strikes after 1934-5 began to sweep the United States, clear across. New organizations were formed, an entirely new type of trade union was created, essentially the heir of the industrial workers of the world. Because the traditional American labor movement had been organized around crafts, so that in a single factory you could have 4, 5, 6, 7 different unions. And if a strike broke out, say, among the machinists, the, sweepers or the painters or whatever you like, or construction workers in the same factory would be free to cross the picket line, because this was a machinist strike, you see. The idea of industrial organization, namely organizing an entire factory, which was the inspired ideal of the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, now became routine as a way of organizing the mass industries in the United States that had not been affected by the trade union movement, the traditional trade union movement. So a new type of confederation, or federation if you like, emerged, and that was called the Committee for Industrial Organizations, which later changed its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. These began to sweep in the auto workers, which could not be organized on a craft union basis. They began to sweep in textile workers. They began to sweep in various kinds of different mining workers, such as copper miners. We already had the United Mine Workers, traditional organization of the miners going way back in time. And we began to see all these large basic industries being organized, and the general technique that they used was to take over the factory. They just didn't form a picket line. They occupied the factory. They were called sit-ins, largely inspired, by the way, by the French workers, who in 1935 occupied factories and raised red flags in Paris and elsewhere. So American workers began to occupy factories, particularly the auto industry, which was the main thrust. And the United States almost building its industrial revolution in great part around the automobile industry, Henry Ford and the like, having produced mass production, given rise to mass production. So this got us involved. But I began to drift away from the Young Communist League, because as the third period came to an end, and as Stalin gave orders to all the various communist parties to become respectable, to appear as lovers of peace and democracy, because he was interested in forming alliances throughout Europe and America with the so-called democracies against fascism, notably Hitler in particular. So the communist movement began to change its character, and from this intense, very taut, very closely knit, revolutionary, almost insurrectionary vanguard organization that began to throw its doors open to everyone and began to make alliances with liberals, which seemed to me at that time to be heinous, absolutely a violation of Marxist and Leninist principle, and I drifted away.
So you were happier in the Communist Party before the...
I never was in the Communist Party. I was in the Young Communist League.
Right. You were happier with the more hidebound, more introspective structure.
Well, I was happier with the more revolutionary structure. It was not a question of hidebound or introspective. What I wanted to belong to was a revolutionary organization, and I remain a revolutionary to this very day. I don't like the capitalist system, which doesn't mean by any means that I am a supporter of the Stalinist type of system or the Bolsheviks. But I don't like capitalism. I oppose it. I think it's an irrational social order. And when I began to see communists making compromises on these basic principles, I began to drift away from the organization, and I almost became a Trotskyist. But again, the usual inefficiencies and connections and whatever you like led to a breakdown in communication between myself, at least, and the Trotskyist movement. And finally, I went back into the Young Communist League as the Spanish Civil War began to approach. I felt that this was something that was really inspirational, something that one could truly believe in. I saw it as a revolution. I didn't see it as a war by democracy against fascism. So in this point of view, unknowingly, having nothing to do with anarchists, I really began to move toward an anarchistic position. However, I remained in the communist movement until 1939, drifting away very slowly, but still officially remaining in there until 1939. In the meantime, since the communist movement prohibited people from talking to anyone but communists, as it were, or liberals, it was heinous and absolutely good grounds for expulsion to talk to a Trotskyist, to have a mother who was a Trotskyist, to have a sister, brother, father, whatever you like, daughter, son, whatever. You had to break with them. They were so much afraid, the communists, of exposing their own members to the critiques that Trotskyists or anarchists or left-wing socialists had to offer, that they created, as it were, a self-enclosed world with reference to other left-wing organizations. On the other hand, you could associate with liberals, which I found rather distasteful. With the result that I became very skeptical. In 1937, particularly May 1937, the anarchists rose in Barcelona, and I was very sympathetic to that uprising. And I was supposed to be a communist, and I was supposed to condemn them. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. This was also followed by the Moscow trials, in which all my leaders and teachers in the communist movement were being accused of being fascists, poisoning wells, doing whatever you like, who knows, and collaborating with Hitler. And I couldn't believe the testimony that I was hearing at the Moscow trials. I knew it was coerced. I knew it was utterly fraudulent. And I became so distant by 1937, 1938 from the communist movement that I began to talk to oppositional elements, such as Trotskyists, people who were supporters of Bukharin, Nikolai Bukharin. They were called Lovstonites in the United States. I began to talk to left-wing socialists, and I violated every rule in the book. But they didn't expel me. They regarded me, even at the age of 17 and 18, as an old Bolshevik, because I had been in the movement since I was 9. So they wanted me to go to an analyst to be psychoanalyzed, you understand. What was wrong with me psychologically that I should talk to Trotskyists and Lovstonites and left-wing socialists? I declined that wondrous opportunity. They used to call them comrades, psychiatrists, who were people, psychoanalysts who were in the communist movement. And then in 1939, I gloatingly showed up for the first time in months at a meeting of my branch of the Young Communist League. Stalin and Hitler had signed a pact, and I wanted to find out what they were going to do with that piece of information. So my county committee leader turned around and said, "Bookchin, you are expelled." And I said, "Why did you wait so long?" And I walked out. And from that particular point on, I drifted into the Trotskyist movement. I was called a Trotskyist, so I decided to be one for a while. And then finally I moved toward libertarian socialism and anarchism.
From your perspective, the CPUSA was once an important force. Now it is irrelevant by any standards. Is the decline of the CPUSA simply a matter of Stalinist internal methods?
To a very great extent, I would say yes. Stalinist, and I would even say Leninist, but that would have defined the CPUSA. Lenin's idea of creating an international that was going to follow very strict principles and ultimately was to be governed by Moscow. Zinoviev being its first chairman, if my memory is correct, Communist International, being its first chairman, and, as it were, Bolshevizing the party, all the communist parties throughout the world, without any regard whatever to the various differences that existed in Western Europe as distinguished from Eastern Europe, in the United States as distinguished from Europe generally, and elsewhere throughout the world, trying to Bolshevize it, to render it homogeneous, and to recreate it in the image of the Russian Communist Party, irrespective of whether or not the Soviet government was using it for diplomatic purposes, was a disaster. It was the beginnings of the destruction of the Communist International, not to speak of the fact that Lenin made very stringent demands upon the various communist parties, with the result that the Communist International became a very homogenized organization, The various communist parties, especially in the 1930s, became very subservient to the Soviet Union and became instruments of Soviet foreign policy. They ceased to have any political integrity of their own.
It's impossible to be entirely objective about it, but do you think, with hindsight, that the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was a wrong turning?
Disaster. A tragic disaster. I know that had I been alive, and with the state of mind, overall state of mind, I'm not talking of hindsight now, that I'm in, committed to a revolutionary movement, committed to the overthrow of capitalism, and committed also to a democratic form, and I would say a libertarian form of socialism, which is what I define anarchism as, I would have been a Bolshevik. There's no question about it. And many anarchists became Bolsheviks. They did. Many people went, and some became disappointed, and others adapted completely. And so there was a lot of coming and going. But when I look back in hindsight, I would say that if the Bolshevik Revolution had not occurred, had they the wisdom to realize the outcome of their party and what their movement would have meant, then I will tell you bluntly and frankly that they have shaped the 20th, the 21st, and for all I know, the 22nd century. They totally, unknowingly, unwittingly, and especially with Stalin almost wittingly, discredited the very ideals of socialism. Whether you speak of libertarian socialism or you speak of other forms, Marxian forms, they literally and unknowingly, and against their will in some respects, discredited one of the greatest ideals in human history.
Let me.
Up to you.
No, I want to come on to that. But you've described the Russian Revolution as a disaster, which is going to distort history for the next century or more.
Yeah.
That seems politics of despair.
No, it's not, because there were alternatives, and they still exist. And that can be described, namely the wedding, I would like to think, of the ecological movement and the libertarian movement into a new kind of politics, which I think is a possibility and which I'm advocating right now. What I'm trying to simply say is that there was a wonderful ideal that goes roughly from the French Revolution up to the Spanish Civil War. And in the Spanish Civil War, or more precisely the Spanish Revolution, as I like to call it, particularly from the years 1936 to 1937, through those 2 years, tremendous experiments were made by the anarchist and the anarcho-syndicalist movement in Spain. It was as though the proletariat and proletarian socialism, having reached its end, flowered, such as it never had before. But what we did was unknowingly, or what the communists did, and later on knowingly in the case of Stalin and Stalinism, was bring a tremendous historical epoch to an end. We no longer consider socialism in the traditional sense of proletarian socialism, the socialism of the working class, a really serious force today in history, where in the 1930s it appeared like revolution was imminent, and there were several insurrections. It's easy to forget that the Austrian workers in February 1934 rose up with red banners against the Dollfuss regime, which tried to suppress the Austrian Socialist Party. They took up arms, and they fought for approximately a week, and they were subjected to artillery bombardments in Vienna. This was a proletarian insurrection. And then again, it's easy to forget that the anarcho-syndicalist movement was not a peasant movement, as Eric Hobsbawm would have us believe. By 1936, it was overwhelmingly proletarian, and particularly the proletariat of Zaragoza, machine shops and railroad workers, the proletariat of Barcelona, a great variety of consumers' goods, textiles, shoemaking, whatever you like, steel workers, anarcho-syndicalist steel workers in Figueros up in the north, a large number of the miners, although predominantly socialist, but a very sizable percentage of the miners in Asturias were anarcho-syndicalists, and the peasants in very large numbers as well took over the industry, took over the economy, and gave us extraordinary examples of direct workers self-management of industry, forming confederations through massive trade unions, and that there was an anarcho-syndicalist movement that numbered at least 1 million members out of 24 million people in Spain. So these are incredible, visions, opportunities, and possibilities, and Stalinism and indirectly Bolshevism foreclosed these historic possibilities. So we're paying the penalty of losing a whole era between 1793 and 1939, which is a tragedy of incalculable dimensions.
But you repudiate Leninism, you repudiate revolutionary vanguardism, but you also accept that if you would have been in Russia in 1917, you would have been a Bolshevik.
Yes.
But what should have happened in Russia in 1917?
All right. Now, once it's understood and one lives in the midst of events one cannot predict or cannot easily predict, and I don't even think the anarchists so clearly saw the outcome. They had a general overview that an authoritarian form of socialism could lead to a bureaucratic form, frankly, of state capitalism. And in this, they were far ahead of everyone else. The Emma Goldmans, the Alexander Berkmans, the Peter Kuropotkins, the whole group, Malatesta and the like. In this respect, the anarchists must be given the palm for foresight and insight. But in the particular moment and heat, when red flags are flying, when workers and soldiers are carrying bayoneted rifles, the mythology is they charged the Winter Palace and they did this, and the Civil War breaks out for 3 or 4 years. At that particular point, it would have been very difficult to see what would happen. But now, looking back, after so many years, and evaluating, and the Russian question was one of the biggest questions that existed right up to the Second World War. Everybody was discussing the Russian question, the nature of the Soviet state. Was it a worker state? Was it a degenerated worker state? Was it state capitalist? Was it bureaucratic collectivist? Leaving all these questions aside, Lenin should not have taken the power. Or if Lenin did take the power, and it was the Bolsheviks who took the power, they should have eased it back and restored it to some kind of Soviet democracy in which the Bolsheviks did not try as a party to supplant the Soviet system that they had created. And they did that. They supplanted it. And Lenin did it consciously. Lenin had a profound disrespect for the Soviets. The workers' and soldiers' councils and peasant councils, which is what the word Soviet really means, this was something he really shoved aside and began to replace by the Bolshevik Party, which became congruent with a new kind of state, a commissariat, a tremendous bureaucracy, which incidentally he was very panicked by. Toward the end of his life, he didn't know what to do with it. So he always created one bureaucracy to counteract the other bureaucracy. You see what I mean? In order to control the growth of, say, this part of the bureaucracy, he established the organization committee, and then afterward the workers' control committee, or party control committee. I may not have the names down exactly. So he used one bureaucracy to counteract another bureaucracy. Very vaguely in his mind, in an amazing article, only one, he spoke of the possibility of a communal movement arising from the masses. But then he saw that this was teetering over into syndicalism, and that frightened him, and he withdrew from that, and then went back to creating one committee to counteract another committee, and each one of these committees became bureaucracies that Stalin took control of and ultimately used against the Bolshevik Party itself, and it's most idealistic people.
But you reject now the notion of a political party, and you work outside conventional political parties.
Yes. But I should not say, on the other hand, I should emphasize that I do not eschew politics. I've made a threefold division in my mind, and I think that has some theoretical value. I believe that we have a social sphere, that social sphere being our immediate lives, the places in which we work, the places in which we form friendships and the like. And then I believe on the other side, and anarchists generally work with these ideas, we have the state. And the state is a professional apparatus, and the nation-state in particular is a relatively new, as history goes, professional apparatus of people selected out of the population with the express purpose of managing the rest of society, presumably in the interests of people as a whole and usually in the interests of various classes and hierarchies. Well, in between that is another sphere which the Greeks understood existed and were very self-conscious about, and that Jean-Jacques Rousseau knew existed, and that was the political sphere. Jean-Jacques Rousseau did not identify, and the Greeks did not identify, I'm talking the ancient Athenians, did not identify politics with the state. They saw that as a public sphere, as a realm of active, self-governing citizens in a face-to-face democracy. And although Rousseau would not have felt that you could return to such a face-to-face democracy, the Greeks gave us marvelous examples, and not just the Greeks, but throughout the course of history, there are marvelous examples where on a municipal level, people did establish this new phenomenon, which was neither strictly social and certainly was anti-statist. And this they called the political sphere. And that political sphere, which I would designate as libertarian municipalism, because I feel that the most immediate level of that sphere is the municipality or the neighborhood or the town, with municipal forms of property, in contrast to the nationalized, centralized property of the Marxist ideal, and in contrast with the capitalist systems or even the syndicalist systems of either private entrepreneurs or collective entrepreneurs. Because workers can, when they control a factory, behave no differently. If they live in a market society, they will behave no differently than capitalists will. They will compete with each other. And that even occurred in the early months of the Spanish Revolution, where workers-controlled factories were competing with other workers-controlled factories. So, considering all the options we have, my view is that we should develop a municipalized economy. And all of this should be confederated, not nationalized, but confederated into free associations, councils of confederal deputies from all the different municipalities, all the different neighborhoods. For example, London. We've already had the Greater London Council. The Greater London Council could have been a confederation, confederal council made up of all the different neighborhoods of the London area. And the people in their different neighborhoods, in their various, shall we say, people's houses, casas de pueblos, which is the Spanish concept of the people's house, would have met together and made political decisions as well as engaged in discussion and turned politics into an everyday life and, very importantly, an everyday education, which politics is not. Politics is a spectatorial sport today that you look at on television or that you hear from microphones. You're part of a mass audience and all you can do is nod and say yes or no and so on and so forth. In the United States today, there is a very distinct revolt against this kind of statist politics. People want to call in. They want responses. They want to be recognized. And so a facade is being created of a new politics based on television. This is being used by this man, Ross Perot, with very, very great effect. He is appealing to something that is very, very strongly felt in the United States. They don't trust the government anymore. They don't believe in any of the institutions or that they are workable, although they are, in a broad sense, Republicans, with a small r. I don't mean members of the Republican Party. They believe in what they call a representative democracy, but they're not too sure that they trust any of their representatives. So what's happening is the whole party system in the United States is collapsing to an extent that is not happening anywhere else in the world, neither in Britain, neither in Europe, anywhere on the continent, no place. Now, nobody is thinking in terms of parties today. What they're thinking in terms of what do people have to say and what access do they have to these candidates and what control do they have over these candidates. And this is being used with very great effect by the right. You have, for example, the Lombardy League. You have, for example, various groupings in Germany, and so on and so forth. And in the United States, I don't know what Mr. Perot's politics may be, but I suspect they are essentially toward rightward. And this sense that people want some kind of direct democracy, they don't know how to form their views about it, they haven't crystallized their ideas about these things, this is being co-opted by the right because the left, with their typical obstinacy that is so painstaking is nailed, crucified to the figure of Karl Marx. Incredible. He has said everything in the world. He is either an ecologist or he's an anti-ecologist. He is either a feminist or he's a misogynist. He is anything you want to make him to be. All you need is somebody to sit down and scribble down and say, well, Marx and Engels didn't agree on something, you know? So everything is dumped on Engels. Whatever you don't like in Marx is dumped on Engels. Whatever you like in Engels is dumped on Marx. So it goes, this insanity, which justifies, in my opinion, the decline of Marxism. Marxism was a fascinating theory, but I'll tell you one thing, it was great in 1860 maybe, and it was filled also with very toxic elements. It was not utopian in vision, it was not confederal, it was national, centralized, strong centralized economies, strong centralized states, proletarian dictatorships, and Lenin picked up on that, either exaggerating it, extending it, use whatever term you want, and we now have the catastrophe of socialism today.
But nevertheless, when you were a young pioneer, you must have felt that you had the world at your feet, the movement. Now, social ecology is a small, influential but very small strand of thought.
But social ecology has a message, and the question is not whether it's small or large, but whether it speaks to the truth of a situation. That's the real problem. The right is using ideas that social ecology should be delivering to the left. That's the problem. The question is the extent to which people are being conditioned on the left today. Either people break with Marxism, in which case they go into the professoriate, and they go and they dabble in critical theory, and Adorno and Horkheimer, or they dabble in Gramsci. If they didn't have Gramsci, I don't know what the heck they would do. They'd made Gramsci more than Gramsci ever was in real life. Gramsci was a Stalinist. In spite of all, he supported the Moscow trials. But Gramsci is supposed to have added something. They want to, in other words, let me put it this way, rather than be libertarian in the full sense of the word and follow the logic of their position, which would lead them, in my view, to social ecology, they have instead tried everywhere along the way to get little subtexts out of Karl Marx or out of Gramsci or out of some other groupuscule or out of some other tendency, generally academic in nature, such as the Frankfurt School, and they have tried to recreate an ensemble largely eclectic and largely in conflict with itself. If social ecology is small, so be it. Then the right will win. I'm sorry to say that. Or worse will happen. Neither the right nor the left will win. We'll have catastrophe, and it'll be ecological. At least social ecology is trying to address the most important collision, first of all, that we have today. It is not between wage labor and capital anymore. That's what the Marxists believed, and that's what many anarchists still believe. But that's beside the point. The biggest collision we have faced today, the limits of capitalism, which were a matter of great discourse, among Marxists and anarchists, what are the historical limits of capitalism that will bring it to an end? Those historical limits are the collision course between capitalism and the natural world. And that is now coming on us almost every day with the warming of the weather, with the extension of summer, with the droughts, with literally the ecological catastrophes, quite aside from nuclear power and everything else that we're faced with, the pollution of the planet. We are literally changing the whole biosphere. We are changing the climate. We are changing the atmosphere, and we are changing seasons. We're exposing young people now to ultraviolet radiation because the ozone layer is thinning out. In Australia, children have to wear scarves around their necks now because there's a very great danger that they will get skin cancer, and most seriously, very aggressive skin cancers that claim 90 or 99% of life. These are problems that people are now faced with. Not to speak of a spiraling downward effect, or what we usually call positive feedback, to use an absurd terminology, I guess, and that is that this very ultraviolet radiation is going to destroy a good deal of the plant life that is responsible for the oxygen in our atmosphere, and at the same time the absorption of the carbon dioxide that will be that is gradually increasing in such great quantity in the atmosphere that it's beginning to warm up the planet in all probability. So Social ecology people may or may not decide to respond to social ecology with its message that the real source of ecological crises are social crises, and that the ideas of dominating nature stem from the domination of human by human, not just exploitation, but domination. Now, if people do not accept that, if this is a minority voice, so be it. But all I can do is address the truth. I cannot take the truth and warp it. To warp the truth is not only a question of retaining my own integrity and my own sense of principle, it is literally to mislead people today. And people are being misled on a lavish scale everywhere. With the result, I repeat, that the right is taking over initiatives that should be taken over by the libertarian left. But the libertarian left, as I told you, is crucified to the 19th century. It's literally mired in the 19th century. It can't shake off the fact that an era has come to an end and that a new one is emerging that must be coped with entirely new frameworks, thoughts, habits, and so on and so forth.